Hello, I'm Dan Curry with the Deeds of God website, here to discuss another one of God's great deeds from the centuries. This discussion is about how the Vikings became Christian. Not all the Vikings, but the Danes, the Danish people. As far as the Vikings go, it's generally said that there were the Norwegians, the Swedes, and the Danes. The Estonians got into the act a little bit too. But as for the Norwegians, they were a little later than the Danes, and they were sort of, I guess you would say, forced into it by their king, Olaf. Olaf was a force to be feared. And as for the Swedes, they generally just sort of thought their way into it. There wasn't, so far as I've been able to find, any especially significant single event that really caused the Swedes to believe in Christianity. They just are a thoughtful, contemplative sort of people in certain situations, and they just sort of thought their way into becoming Christians, I guess. But the Danes kind of have a point, a significant event, a miracle that happened that was kind of impacting for them and kind of convinced them that there really was something to this. And it happened in about 960 AD. I don't know the exact time in the 960s, but it was the time of the Vikings. The king at this time, his name was Harold Bluetooth. We have Bluetooth technology, communication technology, and it's named after this guy, Harold Bluetooth. I've read, this is actually kind of hard to find the answer for, but I was trying to find out why was he called Harold Bluetooth, and I did finally come across something that said that the Danish Vikings thought it made them look more warlike to paint bands of color on their teeth when they went raiding. Like you might have a band of yellow and you might have a band of blue. And it's believed by these people that Harold Bluetooth just enjoyed painting blue bands onto his teeth. And so anyway, Harold Bluetooth was the king of Denmark. And, just to discuss the Viking Age just a little, the kind of people we're dealing with here. I'll tell you one time I was reading a little bit of Irish history from a book by a guy named Seamus McManus. And he was discussing how at a certain point in Ireland, the Norwegians were coming and raiding, and sometimes they'd stay and keep land, and the Danish would come and raid, and sometimes they'd keep land. And sometimes the Danish ran into the Norwegians in Ireland. Now they both would do a lot of harm to the Irish, but sometimes when they ran into each other in Ireland, they would raid upon each other and make war upon each other there. And in this one episode I was reading about in A History of Ireland by Seamus McManus, he's discussing how a priest from long ago, a Christian priest, left an account of traveling across the land to a village, and when he was getting kind of close, he saw that smoke was rising from it. And he, for whatever reason, wasn't particularly afraid for his own safety, but he thought it was probably a Scandinavian raid, and it was. And what had happened this day is the Danes and the Norwegians had gone at it. I don't know which one got there first and who raided the other one's semi-permanent settlement, but they got into a big battle that day, and the Danes had won. It was cold, it was winter, the ground was covered with frost or snow, and it was hard. And when the priest got there, he said he was walking into a kind of a scene of carnage. There was buildings burning, this sort of thing, dead people laying all over wherever they happened to have fallen. And the Danes were celebrating, their victory over the Norwegians, and they decided to kill some cattle and cook them. Have a barbecue. So they had built sort of like a swing set, 2 A-frames and a pole, and the beef was hanging from it, but it was cold and they couldn't really dig holes for the tips of the A-frames, so they had drugged some dead Norwegians over and cut holes in their thorax and stuffed the end poles of the A-frames into these 4 Norwegians that were their their stability, their support for their cow cooker. And the priest said that the smell of the Norwegians cooking was about as strong as the smell of the cow cooking. It's quite a scene to him. And he remarked to one of the Danes, apparently he was able to speak their language, he remarked to one of the Danes that it was quite a sight. And the guy just shrugged and said, well, they'd have done the same to us. The Viking times were hard times. These were pretty rough guys. Well, anyway, in Harold Bluetooth's day, Denmark was shifting towards becoming a Christian country. You know, it had started in about the year 712 with a guy named Willibrord, and he had been allowed to teach some, not to very great effect, but somebody had allowed him to take 30 young Danish men and return to his neck of the woods and school them in Christian theology. And you know, there's not much record of what happened. There's a record that he was allowed to take the 30 young men to teach them, and then the story kind of ends. But you can sort of imagine that at least some of them came back to Denmark and probably taught something about the Christian faith. They probably brought a little familiarity with it. And then about 150 years later, so you know, you would have been looking in the 860s, the first Christian church was built, and this was by a guy whose name was Ansgar. He was a German, you know, at least what they called Germany, one of the German tribes from that period. And so the first Christian church was built in Denmark. And then about 100 years later, there came a day when this account occurred. It was in the 960s AD. The king was Harold Bluetooth, and Harold was of mixed theological parentage. His father Gorm was a pagan, and his mother Thyra was a Christian. You know, and Gorm and Thyra had married each other, and I guess they raised him to just, you know, choose as he chose. And he, I think, had kind of one foot in both worlds, to tell you the truth, from what I've read about him. He wasn't, I don't think, a very convinced or committed Christian, but he wasn't close to the Christian faith either. So, back in those days in Denmark, other Scandinavian countries as well, they would have get-togethers, fairs. You know, you would get together at the big fair, you would trade items, you would hear the news, the politicians, you know, really they were rulers, I guess, would, you know, give speeches, talk about things that were going on, maybe recruit troops, and of course marriages were proposed and either accepted and rejected. You know, there's a lot of things that went on at these fairs. They're important. Well, in Denmark there was a fair going on, and they didn't call them fairs, they called them things. You know, like the English word thing apparently stems from this. A get-together was called a thing. So when you traveled to a thing, you know, there was a lot of clans, right? There's a lot of clans, small tribal divisions, families that didn't always get along, and sometimes, you know, they would make war on each other or have opportunistic raids or even killings of somebody from the other clan passing through your land, and you catch them out in the open. They might be fair game, but for a thing, everybody got safe passage to the thing and away from the thing. You know, it was a time of peace, a time of national get-together. Sometimes you had to all join up to fight an enemy. You know, you had to have a national identity too, and this was important in building national identities. So there was a thing going on, and one of the other rules is that once you got to the thing, you couldn't have warfare, you couldn't have fighting, you couldn't have disruptions. It was a time of friendliness. Now, true, they would bring their court cases, you know, to the thing to have them decided and adjudicated as their laws, you know, conducted that sort of thing. But that was also done in a peaceful and sober manner, and if you committed a crime, you'd be assigned a certain amount of money you'd have to pay as your punishment. You know, something was handed out to whoever was found to be the guilty party, and as long as they paid it, even if they had committed a murder in some of the Scandinavian countries, as long as they paid the weir guild that was assigned to them as a punishment, they were good. So anyway, I'm not sure exactly where Denmark's at, but I'm speaking a little too much about this probably. But so there was a thing. It was supposed to be a time of peace. Harold Bluetooth was there presiding over it. He probably gave speeches during part of it. And on one of the days, an argument broke out. Now, there were getting to be a lot of Christians, you know, in this time. Some of the crowd was Christian. But there wasn't supposed to be an argument, and it was sounding pretty loud and hostile. So among the people who went over to see what was going on, and it shouldn't have been going on, was Harold Bluetooth, the king. And when he went over there, there was a priest whose name was Papo. He was a Christian priest. And Papo was a missionary in that area at the time, and he was having kind of a loud argument with a bunch of people from the old religion, you know, and this would have been the Asgardian religion, about how their gods were nothing but trolls. You know, a troll was like a monster, a demon, lived under bridges, that sort of thing. He was insulting their gods, saying that they weren't anything, and if they were anything at all, they were nothing but trolls, and that it was Jesus that was the Son of God, Jesus that was, you know, the rightful King of men and the Savior, and there was nobody else to be worshipped, that God Almighty, the Father, had sent Jesus. And so anyway, that's what was causing this big stir, this big argument, and you know, it was a kind of a time in their nation's history when that was happening a lot, that argument. So Harold Bluetooth's listening, trying to sort it out, and he calls silence to the situation, and he gets the story, and he says to Popo something to the effect that, you spoke some pretty harsh, strong words there. Are you willing to back those up? And Popo apparently said, well, yes, he was. He did stand behind his words. And Harold Bluetooth said, are you willing to take the test of hot iron? Well, the test of hot iron was more mythical than actual. It was part of their heritage, but it didn't happen much. Most people probably never had even seen it. But they had a lot of high iron content dirt. They used to bake it in kilns, and when you bake the pile of dirt and mud long enough, there'd be a chunk of iron in there, and you could shake it off and knock it clean, and it'd be pretty much all iron. And then you give it to a blacksmith, he might hammer out a sword. They made their own weaponry and things like that, in these regions, Scandinavian regions. A lot of iron in the soil in some places. So they had the blacksmiths. Well, the test of hot iron was you get a chunk of iron glowing red hot, and if you're an innocent man, you can go pick up that red hot iron, and it does nothing to you. That was their legend, that was their myth, their heritage test. And like I say, from what I read, it wasn't really practiced, but it was, of course, well known. And Papa said, yeah, I'm willing to take the test of our hot iron. So Bluetooth says, well, then you shall. And so, just for safety's sake, he had him held overnight, and maybe so he wouldn't disappear, but I don't think Papa had any intention of disappearing. And I didn't read that he prayed all night, but I'm quite sure he probably did. And in the morning, everybody gathered out of curiosity to see what was going to happen here. And Papa was brought forward, and the crowd was there, the king was there, and a blacksmith had a chunk of iron, don't know its exact size, heated up red hot. That was something that was mentioned as, hot, 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 glowing hot. And when it was so hot that no man could touch a chunk of iron like that, it was time. So they nodded, and Papa stepped forward, and he went over and he grabbed it with confidence and faith, picked it up, and he walked around in front of everybody, apparently in a calm enough way, until everybody was convinced, well, no man could have escaped harm by now. And he set it back down, and he held up his hands, and his hands were unharmed. They weren't blistered, they weren't cooked, and they weren't burned. So Harold Bluetooth said, well, I stand convinced, essentially. He said, you've proved your point. And so he declared that Denmark would become a Christian nation, that it was official. And soon enough, he had a large statue of Jesus made, which Jesus probably would not have appreciated, but obviously his intent was to honor Jesus. And then, in a town called Jelling, Denmark has a city named Jelling. It was once a royal city. He had a stone erected and written on, which says the following: King Harold had this memorial made for his father, Grog, and his mother, Thyra, the same Harold that conquered all of Norway and Denmark and made the Danes Christian. So, next time you hear the word Bluetooth technology or Bluetooth, you might remember that that's from a Scandinavian king of Denmark from the 960s. He saw Papa perform the test of hot iron and come out unharmed, and he declared Denmark a Christian nation. It's a mighty act of God. Great deed of God. I'm Dan Curry from the Deeds of God website, which has over 100 such accounts from history. I hope you'll visit, and I hope you'll tell your friends. Thank you.